Well, good evening, everyone. This is Jacob Hornberger, and welcome to the Jacob Hornberger Show. I'm going to share with y'all a news story that is absolutely guaranteed to crack you up. I mean, this thing is absolutely hilarious. You will see in this news story the whole essence of the welfare state and government officials and dictatorships and so forth. It's absolutely fascinating. It comes from the front page of the New York Times, and it was last Thursday, and it reads, the title of it is "In Saudi Arabia, Royal Funds Buy Peace for Now." Now, keep in mind that Saudi Arabia is one of these U.S. supported dictatorships in the Middle East. That's not to say that the U.S. government supports all the dictatorships in the Middle East. We know they don't. They don't support the Libyan dictatorship, where they're over there bombing and killing people right now. They don't support the Syrian dictatorship, the Iranian dictatorship, because these dictatorships, of course, as I've mentioned in previous programs, are independent of the U.S. empire. They're not members of the empire. They're in fact antagonistic to the empire, and so the U.S. doesn't support those dictatorships. Now, of course, there's exceptions. Syria, for example, is a brutal dictatorship. We see them suppressing their own people right now, killing their own people, and the U.S. empire made a deal with them to torture people on their behalf. But that's the exception. Usually it's the U.S. supported dictatorships that do the torturing on behalf of the U.S. and so forth. We're talking about Egypt and Jordan and Yemen and Bahrain and others of these dictatorships that are doing, really bad things to their citizenry. But also included in that list is Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia is a brutal dictatorship. And it's a U.S. supported dictatorship. And they've been looking around about what's going on in the Middle East, and they gotten a little nervous because they know that people are starting to make waves, or they're starting to ask questions like, what are we doing suffering under a dictatorship? Why do we have to suffer under a dictatorship? Look at our living conditions and so forth. And so obviously, since the Saudi Arabian regime is a dictatorship, they've gotten nervous. So guess what they've done to try to secure their position? Because they see all these revolts and rebellions and resistance to tyranny and so forth. So, well, that's the point of this article. They royal funds buy peace for now. Well, guess what they're doing? Well, they're doing the exact same thing that U.S. officials do over here. They're using government money to expand welfare for the people. I mean, is that just classic welfare statism? That, in other words, the idea is that if we put more welfare in the hands of the people, it'll mollify them, it'll settle them down. They won't be so hep on revolting or rebelling and so forth. It's really like a narcotic. I mean, that's what I've long argued about the welfare state here in America. It's a narcotic. It's like a sedative. It pacifies the people. It mollifies them, and it makes them scared about losing it because they get dependent on it. I mean, we've seen it here with Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and education grants and farm subsidies and, community grants. People get dependent on this largesse, and so they're not going to challenge the government because the government might cut them off. That's the danger of becoming a ward of the state, to go on the dole. The reason that we call it a paternalistic system is because, we'll take like a little 6 or 7 year old. A 6 or 7 year old is going to throw tantrums, he's going to cry, he's going to complain and so forth, but he's never going to challenge his parents at a fundamental level. He's not going to challenge their right to serve as his parents or what their role is in his life. Why? Because he knows instinctively that he will die. He will starve to death if they simply say, we're out of here, we're walking away. So the kid always has to create his tantrums and crybaby stuff and everything within a certain parameter. That's exactly the way it is with adults under a welfare state. They're not going to challenge the government, their daddy, paternalism, or if you will, their mommy maternalism. They're not going to challenge that at a fundamental level. I mean, you're not going to have seniors, unless they're libertarians, that are going to be saying, we need to reevaluate the entire warfare state. The fact that America is an empire instead of a republic. You're not going to see seniors doing that, because instinctively they get this sense that if the daddy gets mad, he could just walk away. No more Social Security, no more Medicare, no more free this, no more free that. That's the problem. Now, the Saudis understand that. Now, get this. This is what they're doing. Says that King Abdullah, they've got a king there in Saudi Arabia. He paid an extra 2 months' salary to government employees and spent $70 billion alone for 500,000 units of low-income housing. So, now he's trying to hedge his bets against the poor people. In case the poor people say, we don't really like living conditions here. We'll mollify them. We'll give them this sedative. We'll just inject a little bit of welfare into their veins, and then that calms them down, just settles them down, and the king can remain king. The dictatorship can remain in power. Now, here's another great one. As a reward to the religious establishment, King Abdullah allocated about $200 million to religious organizations, to the religious establishment, including what the Times called the religious police. Now, imagine that. Here's a U.S.-supported dictatorship partnering with this dictatorship, and they've got a religion police. And this guy, the king, is allocating money to these religion groups. He's spreading the money across society in order to mollify them, pacify them, and also enlist their support in case there are people, because obviously, they can't give the dole out to everybody. And so if people do start to resist, if there are some demonstrations, he has fortified his base. He's expanded his base. This way, the people that are getting these benefits, these doles, this welfare, they will side with the government, and they come to the assistance of the government. In fact, they even point that out indirectly. They said clerics opposed to democratic changes crowed that they had won a great victory over liberal intellectuals. And then they quote a guy that says, the liberals don't care about the security of the country. All they care about is the mingling of genders. They want girls to drive cars. Isn't that something? The liberal intellectuals, as they put it here, they want girls to drive cars. Can you imagine that? And this is, they want to go to beaches to see girls in bathing suits. Oh my gosh. Well, we can't have that. We've got to keep sending out this dole in order to keep this dictatorship in power that the U.S. government partners with, along with the other dictatorships. Now, here's what this young cleric says. He says, financial support to organizations that the liberals dislike was, quote, a way to cut out their tongues. So you see, you go and you start spreading the money amongst all these people, the religion police and the government employees and the poor people, and you give them a dole, and then all of a sudden you diminish the chances of revolt or revolution or rebellion. That's one of the biggest benefits of the welfare state. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt understood that when he brought in the welfare state to America. That was the advent of the welfare state. That was when Social Security was enacted. He knew that if he could get enough people on the dole, that those people would become mollified, sedated, that they wouldn't challenge government at a fundamental level. And of course, in the case of the United States, the primary core feature of the U.S. government is its warfare state. The empire. 700 to 1,000 bases all over the world. You've got troops everywhere. You got occupying 2 separate countries. You got assassinations, bombings, killings, and that all that is power. They call it a footprint. They got a footprint, a military footprint all over the world. And this is where the force of government. You remember George Washington said government is force? That's where the force is being initiated, through the military, through the CIA. And this is where they have dominance, control, power, money, because there's no constraints on what the federal government can do once it leaves American shores. The president can attack any country he wants. He has total dictatorial power. He does no longer, he ignores the Constitution with respect to a declaration of war. Doesn't even bother with it anymore. And Congress doesn't impeach him. We all know it's the law. Everybody acknowledges it's the law, but nobody cares. The Supreme Court doesn't step in. They copped out, decades ago and said, well, we're not going to get involved because nobody has standing to bring this kind of case. And because you know why they said that? Because they knew the president wouldn't go along with the Supreme Court decision anyway in this regard. The president can do whatever he wants. He's got a private army. Essentially, the army is his private army. The loyalty is to him. They say they pledge allegiance to the Constitution, but that's nonsense. Their allegiance is to the president. Whatever the president orders, the soldiers, the troops are going to obey. And in their mind, they're supporting and defending the Constitution by following whatever orders the president orders them to follow. And so you've got this total power, this military dominance, the military-industrial complex, enormous impact in American life. You got, how many tens of thousands of businesses are dependent on military contracts, even if it's just to supply goods and services and coffee and soft drinks or whatever. But, when the citizenry start getting restless, they start, thinking about the high taxes to pay for all this, the debt, the out of control spending, the inflation, that's the printed money to pay off the huge deficit, the difference between what they're bringing in taxes and what they're spending. When citizens start to figure out something and they start to realize the role that the Federal Reserve has in all this, then of course the IRS, this vicious agency that destroys so many lives, and the debt, lending out to the Chinese communists, who are now America's premier creditor. People get restless. That's what the Tea Party's all about. They're not libertarians yet. Some of them are, but unfortunately, they're still tending toward conservatism. But they're getting restless, and that's what makes any regime nervous. And it's making the U.S. regime nervous. All these federal bureaucrats and politicians, the statists, they're getting nervous. And so what do? They call for a stimulus plan. Isn't that what we hear? That we need increased spending, after they've just spent out how much money? Gobs of money. And they say, we just need to do it again because they need to mollify people. They need to keep people pacified. Man, those people that are getting an increase in their dole, they're as happy as, peaches and cream, They're just ecstatic. They don't want to go out and revolt or rebel or anything. They just got an increase in their dole. And then that's, of course, the idea behind the welfare state. It keeps people mollified. Now, let me turn to another subject. Well, it's sort of related, but in today's New York Times, Defense Secretary Robert Gates, the audacity, he's warning NATO. And what's he warning them? He says, you're too weak. You're not doing your fair share. You need to start coming together with more money and more, bombs and more missiles and more airplanes. You need to shoulder a bigger share of your responsibility here. And he says the reason for this, or one of the reasons, is because the American people are starting to get restless. Because you've got taxes soaring over here, you got inflation, you've got massive debt. And he's saying, Americans are getting sick and tired of these 10, 11-year wars. Iraq, Afghanistan, this is longer than Vietnam, longer than World War II, World War I. a Korean War, and he says, look, Americans may not put up with this forever, and you people need to come up with your share of defense. Now, that's really funny. I mean, can you imagine a guy, now, of course, he is Secretary of Defense, but when was the last time you saw the U.S. government involved in a war in which they were defending the United States? I mean, what, World War II? I mean, where the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor? But all these others are just interventions, wars of aggression, occupations. I mean, it's actually comical because what Gates is saying, it falls in the context of what's going on in Libya. Now, of course, Libya, as I mentioned earlier, is not one of the U.S.-supported dictatorships. And so when they saw an opportunity to oust Gaddafi from power because there was a rebellion in his land, they took it. Now, Obama lied through his teeth, but of course this is nothing new. I mean, Johnson lied through his teeth about the supposed attack at the Gulf of Tonkin. Bush lied through his teeth on the reason that he was invading Iraq was WMDs, So Obama came and said, "Oh, we're really attacking to protect civilians because we're so concerned about civilians." Well, how come they're not concerned about civilians in Bahrain or Yemen, where their dictators are killing people, killing civilians? Well, because it's the hypocrisy and the lies that really what this was all about, and it's now been exposed. Exposed as the lie it was, is that they just want to get rid of Gaddafi. They've turned on the guy. I mean, they were making friends with him. They settled the Lockerbie bombing thing, and they were making buddies with him. The British were over there funneling arms to him, just like, the U.S. government funnels arms to the dictatorships in Egypt and Jordan and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and so forth. Well, the British were doing this with Gaddafi. And in fact, Obama himself was considering it. And then this rebellion breaks out, and they said, oh, well, here's an opportunity to put our dictator in, expand the empire, put our dictator in, get rid of this guy, and now we've got a little bit better empire here because we got more dictators as part of it. And so, the British were thinking about, funneling. I mean, they did funnel some arms. Obama was thinking about funneling some arms. But so, it turns out, though, that the U.S. and NATO, the NATO countries, especially Britain and France, are the aggressor powers in this conflict. I mean, they're the aggressors. The fact that a civil war is going on off in a country doesn't give any government, any nation state, the legal or moral authority to go in there and start killing people, to interfere in that conflict. And so what Obama and his cohorts have done in NATO is say, well, this is an opportunity. We have an opportunity here to deceive the people by saying, oh, well, we're just concerned about civilians, but we'll use this as an opportunity to bomb the heck out of Gaddafi's forces. They call it degrading his infrastructure and his army and so forth. But really what they're doing is they're killing people. I mean, they're killing his soldiers, all of which have, many of whom have families. They're killing innocent bystanders, and they claim they're not trying to kill him. They claim that they're just trying to degrade his military and his government, and they're attacking government centers where there's government employees that work in there, and but they've killed some of Gaddafi's children. But it's all with the idea of regime change. Now, I've talked about this before. This is one of the primary core missions of the U.S. government, and specifically the Pentagon and the CIA. Regime change. That was what the invasion of Iraq was all about. Okay? Remember that the sanctions that had killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children had not worked. 9/11 comes along, and all of a sudden, opportunity presents itself. Americans are scared to death, mushroom clouds, there's color charts. Colin Powell goes to the UN. Everybody's transfixed. Condoleezza Rice talks about mushroom clouds being the smoking gun, and all this other nonsense. And everybody gets scared, and they use it as the excuse to go in and do what the sanctions had not done, and that was get rid of Saddam. And so that's what you can go back to Iran with the Shah of Iran when they did it there, Guatemala, you talked about that last week. Well, now that's what the idea in Libya is. So what he's saying, what Gates is saying about these NATO countries is that they're not doing enough to, participate in this war of aggression, which, by the way, was a war crime that was declared at Nuremberg, that when you're the attacker, when you're the wrongful intervener, you've committed a war crime. But this is my point again, is that you're not going to see soldiers, individual soldiers, objecting to Obama's orders. He's got no declaration of war. I mean, we all know that that's what the Constitution requires. And he just goes and says, I can do it. I've got an army. The army is going to follow my orders, and it does. And they start bombing the place, and the troops are there saying, we're defending freedom. We're defending freedom, I mean, they convince themselves that whatever their loyalty to the president, and that's where it is, their loyalties to the president, wherever that manifests itself in terms of following his orders, they feel automatically, because it's been ingrained in them, that whatever they're doing, it's defending our freedoms, defending our rights, defending democracy or whatever. But really what they're doing is just following the orders of the commander-in-chief, the ruler. And in this case, he's bombing a country illegally. That is, illegally under our form of government that requires a congressional declaration of war. And then you've also got a law. Now, keep in mind that the Constitution, where the declaration of war requirement is, that's our law, we the people. That's the law that we impose on federal officials. All right? That was the whole idea. I mean, Americans said, all right, we will let the federal government come into existence. This was back in 1787, but only on the condition that, you guys follow our law here. You follow the constraints. And one of those constraints was a president cannot wage war without first getting a congressional declaration of war, because the founding fathers, the framers, they didn't want the nation to be going to war willy-nilly just on the basis of whatever the president wanted. They know that presidents have a lot of pride, and they get their feelings hurt, and they get insulted by other rulers, and so now I got to go to war because, I've been insulted and so forth. They wanted that buffer. They wanted that protection, and that protection was, you got to go to Congress and make your case. Well, they didn't do that. Well, that's the higher law that we the people. So Obama's clearly violating the law. They really ought to impeach him. I mean, I don't see how you could have a better example of a high crime or misdemeanor, which is the grounds for impeachment, than this really a political felony, intentionally, knowingly violating the declaration of war requirement. My feeling is they ought to impeach him and let him come to Congress and defend himself. Let him say, well, other presidents have done it in the past. I thought I could do it too. Let him make that defense. At least it would send a message to all future presidents. This is what's going to happen to you if you violate the law. Now, you've also got the War Powers Act. I mean, that's a congressional law that says when you commit troops, Mr. President, you will come back within 60 days, and you will tell us why they need to be there. And otherwise, you take them out of there. And Obama just ignored that. And even Obama acknowledged the legitimacy of that law when he was running for office. So you got illegality on two grounds, the constitutional ground and then the law enacted by Congress. So that's what they're saying to these European countries. They're saying, hey, why don't you get involved more in our aggression? Now, the irony of this, I don't know, maybe it's not ironic, but the New York Times publishes an editorial today on this same subject. And they're saying, oh, this is just terrible that these countries are shirking their responsibility, that they ought to be bucking up and getting involved and helping us out in Libya and other places, Afghanistan. really, what are they saying? They're saying is, you need to start becoming an aggressor power too. You need to start coming up with money and armaments to attack other countries. You need to be part of the U.S. empire and have your troops at our disposal to attack any country, assassinate any person, kidnap any person. I mean, that's really the essence of the message here. Ask yourself, what do we really need NATO for? Maybe the New York Times has forgotten what NATO was there for. The primary purpose of NATO was to protect Europe from the Soviet Union, the Soviet communist threat. Okay, that's disappeared. And it's gone. There's no more Soviet Union. There's no more Soviet troops in Eastern Europe. There's no more East Germany. There's no more Berlin Wall. And so what do we still have NATO around for? I mean, it's a classic case of bureaucracies just lasting forever. I mean, when the Soviet Union got dismantled, that was the time to dismantle NATO. Say, okay, hey, declare victory in the Cold War and walk away. But that's not what they did. NATO became an instrument of the U.S. empire, where you've got, the old colonialists, Britain, the British Empire. Remember when Britain was an empire and, they go around strutting around the world and so forth with their big footprint? They had colonies everywhere, and you got France, the old colonialists. They're in the Middle East especially. Well, now you got the old colonialists coming in and bombing Libya, killing people, and the New York Times is saying it's not enough. You've got to buck up. You've got to spend more money. Here's what the Times says. Even fully participating members have failed to train enough targeting specialists to keep all of their planes flying sorties. They're talking about Libya. Or to buy enough munitions to sustain a bombing campaign much beyond the present 11 weeks. Well, isn't that just terrible? That these countries just haven't done enough to keep the bombing going, to keep the planes flying, to do whatever is necessary to get rid of Gaddafi from office, despite the fact that it is an absolutely, totally illegal and immoral war. I mean, that thought doesn't even occur to them. I looked at this editorial and I said, my gosh, where is the acknowledgement that this thing's violating the law? There's no declaration of war or the War Powers Act. All I see is just lament. And what's interesting about Gates, Secretary of Defense Gates, and the New York Times, they say, one thing they say is, Europe needs to take part more in its defense. Defense from whom? I mean, who's over there threatening to invade Great Britain? Have you seen any ships or armadas getting going, crossing the English Channel or coming around the backside, from through the North Pole or something? Of course not. You see anybody trying to invade France? Of course, yeah, they call immigrants invaders, but that's ridiculous. I'm talking about a nation state. Do you see any nation states that are, flooding their troops into France? Of course not. I mean, where is this defense? You see, this is part of that delusion that I've talked about in previous shows where, you've got these delusions that these people create that, there's these enemies and the troops are mounting and they're about to invade Great Britain and France and Germany and whatever. Excuse me, but when we're talking about defense, Mr. New York Times, defense from what? Libya's not, attacking France. They're not invading Great Britain. It is these people, the colonialists, the old colonialists, and of course the U.S. empire, that are the aggressors. It is Libya who is defending against their attack. They are the defense. Their Department of Defense is operating as a defense force because it is the old colonialists and the new colonialists that are doing the attacking. And it doesn't matter that Gaddafi is a brutal dictator. That doesn't furnish the legitimacy to break the law and to be bombing another country. In fact, have you noticed, and here we go to the hypocrisy of these people. Have you noticed that in this so-called concern for the civilians, that they haven't been willing to open up immigration barriers in the United States to let in people suffering. I mean, there's people, fleeing Libya. They're getting killed. They're getting bombed by Gaddafi. He's brutal. He's going to do whatever is necessary to establish his control. But of course, any regime would, including the U.S. government. If Americans started to revolt against the U.S. government, started, bombing and shooting and stuff at U.S. troops, I guarantee you that the U.S. government would do everything necessary that Gaddafi is doing to establish order and stability in the country. That doesn't furnish the U.S. government. The fact that this guy is a dictator and he's acting brutally with interventions. But then they won't even let the people who are suffering under this tyranny immigrate to the United States. In other words, we love you. We love the poor and we love civilians, but we don't love you that much. I mean, it really goes to show you the hypocrisy of these liberals. And Obama's not the first one. I mean, remember, we can go all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt, when, he claimed to love the poor, needy, and disadvantaged, and that's why he was establishing Social Security and so forth. And then when the Jews tried to immigrate from Germany, facing, certain death, what was Roosevelt's response? Oh, no, we have immigration controls. Can't let that happen. We love the poor, needy, and disadvantaged, but not that much. And, of course, there's that famous or infamous Voyage of the Damned. Google that one if you don't know about that one. Voyage of the Damned. Just horrific story. I mean, these people are just liars and hypocrites, and they're aggressors, and they're law violators. And here the Times is lamenting because some European countries, they don't even want to participate in this thing. I mean, they've refused to participate. And it says here in this editorial, fewer than half of NATO's 28 members are taking part in the military mission. And the Times is saying this is a horrible thing that they're not participating. Fewer than a third are participating in the all-important airstrikes. British and French aircraft, yeah, the old colonialists, especially in the Middle East, carry the main burden. Canada, Belgium, Norway, and Denmark, despite limited resources, have made outsized contributions. Turkey has remained largely on the sidelines. Germany, NATO's biggest historic beneficiary, has done nothing at all. In other words, Germany was protected from the Soviet threat, and now it owes a duty to the U.S. empire to participate in its aggressive acts against other countries. I mean, this is just shameful. This is absolutely shameful. They need to dismantle NATO. Now, there's another factor here, and I can't believe that Gates is not familiar with this, and certainly the New York Times is familiar, but you don't get a sense of it. They're lamenting that these European countries are not coming forth and participating in this bombing campaign and more to the more of the stuff in Afghanistan and so forth. It's a 10-year war now. When I was a kid, I heard about the 30 years war, and I thought, how does a war go on for 30 years? Well, now I know this one's at 10, and it's going strong, man. It's just getting going. But there's another factor here, and that is that, hey, Europe's broke, guys. I mean, I don't want to burst your bubble or anything, but have you noticed what's happened with Greece? They're busted. And the same with Portugal and Spain and Italy. And their welfare state has busted their countries. Their tax revenues are far exceeding their expenditures are far exceeding their tax revenues. It's the same situation as here in the United States, but they've reached the end of the road where they can't tax people, they can't impose more taxes because then the private sector, which funds the welfare state, it starts to crater in on itself. I mean, they've reached the worst of all possible worlds as far as they're concerned because they can't raise taxes anymore. The more they raise taxes, the more the thing starts to crater because it's the private sector that sustains the government. And yet the people that are on the dole, the welfare recipients, they won't let go of their dole. I mean, so they're stuck. They're busted now. They're getting bailed out, including by American taxpayers. We funnel the money through the IMF, but Make no question, have no question about it. This is the American people who have their own burdens over here, funneling money over to them. But how are they supposed to participate in this aggression and more bombs and airplanes and missiles, Mr. Gates? How about it, editorial board at the New York Times? What do you expect them to do? Have you ever heard of a turnip? Well, if you go buy a turnip at the grocery store, try to squeeze some blood out of it. I bet you're going to have a hard time. That's the problem in Europe. How do you go to these decrepit, busted, bankrupt regimes and say, oh, well, you need to come forward with more bombs and missiles. You need to do some more sorties over Libya. I mean, this is just nonsense. I mean, this whole thing is nonsense. And you know what? It gives you a sense of they don't really care about this debt ceiling, these statists. They don't really care that this country has mountains of debt. They don't give a hoot that the Chinese communists are now America's premier foreign creditor. They don't give a hoot at all. I mean, they just want that debt ceiling raised so they can keep spending and borrowing to their heart's content. And the fact that you and each member of your family owes some $45,000, they don't care. Just keep spending and spending and spending. You know how you know they don't care? Because, they didn't need to attack Libya. I mean, we all knew about this debt ceiling problem. We all knew about this massive debt, right? And that the Federal Reserve is now starting to inflate the money supply, trying to monetize the debt, pay it off in cheap dollars. I mean, you can see the results at the gas pump and in the commodities markets and so forth. But what did he do? What did Obama do with the support of people in Congress? I mean, some are starting to resist now, but, he started a war that's costing, hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, you might say, well, that's not very much, Jacob. It's just a few $100 million. I mean, what's the difference, on a $3 trillion budget? Because it's the point. The point is they don't really care about this. They're not concerned about this massive debt on your shoulders and your children's shoulders and your grandchildren's shoulders. They don't care at all. If they cared, they would have said, we can't afford this. What are we going to do? Go spend out a few $100 million for what? To oust another dictator so we can bring another dictator into the realm of the empire? See, this was an optional war, as most of them are. I mean, it's not defending America. Gaddafi didn't come and come with an armada, invade the United States with his armies and so forth. And this was totally optional. And so knowing the debt ceiling problem, knowing the debt problem, knowing the spending problem, they said, who cares? We'll just go out and spend another, who knows where it's going to end, because they're kind of stuck because Gaddafi's taunting them. And there's nothing worse than I wish Gaddafi would just shut up, because maybe then they'd say, oh, well, okay, we've protected civilians and played the game, the charade, and leave. But with him taunting them, he's teasing them. I mean, they're getting furious, absolutely furious. I forget the number of bombs they dropped on where they think he is. The other day, it was just incredible. And they need more bombs and so forth because the guy's taunting them. So anyway, that's the story there. Let's go over to Afghanistan. Here's an article from the New York Times where the Pentagon is saying, well, let's not be too hasty about reducing troops. You see, because this thing's gone on, 10 years now? I mean, let's face it. The Pentagon and the CIA, have had carte blanche to kill as many people in Afghanistan that they've wanted to, right? I mean, there's been no constraint on them at all. There's no congressional constraint. There's no constitutional constraint that they're honoring. And, of course, there's no declaration of war against. It's an illegal occupation. But what I'm saying is that they have been able to kill what they call terrorists to their heart's content. And that's gone on for 10 years now. I mean, it's the same in Iraq, where there's no declaration of war. Now, if you haven't killed everybody that you need killed, when you've had unlimited money, unlimited ability, unlimited opportunities, planes, air superiority, air supremacy, uh, troops, hundreds of thousands. I mean, if you haven't killed everybody that needs to be killed, there's something wrong here, right? I mean, Gates is saying, the Pentagon's saying, well, it's got to be a gradual withdrawal. Well, all right, let's play like the gradual withdrawal started in 2003, and then we took 7 years to withdraw. I mean, can we do that? Well, not according to him. And let's not be too hasty. We've got to stay there. And why? To protect a dictatorship. Yes, the Karzai regime is a brutal dictatorship. And you can say, oh, but Jacob, he's been democratically elected. Bull. That's just bull. When you have an election where the ballot boxes are stuffed, that is not an election. I mean, you can't say the guy's been elected fraudulently. It's a nullity. It just doesn't count. I mean, let's assume there's an election in your community for mayor, and your mayor, there's 1,000 votes cast, and your mayor gets 1,500 votes, and the other guy gets 0. Now, you can't say, well, the mayor was elected fraudulently, right? Because the idea of an election is legitimate, correct, valid ballots. These are fraudulent ballots. That's not an election at all. That's just a nullity, and that's what Karzai is. I mean, Karzai is a nullity. He's a U.S. supported, U.S. installed dictator, and that's what the troops are there killing and dying for. And the Pentagon says, well, let's not be too hasty. Well, yeah, because they know that if they pull the troops out of Afghanistan anytime soon, which they should, and Iraq, all of a sudden the terrorist threat dissipates. You see, because this goes back to what I've been saying early on in this program, is that it's not that they hate us for our freedom and values and that kind of nonsense. They hate America for its rock and roll and so forth. It's because of the U.S. government has been doing bad things over there. And it was before 9/11. I mean, this was what Ron Paul was saying in that famous debate exchange with Giuliani, is that they came over here to do death and destruction because our government over there had been doing some bad things to them, including the brutal sanctions, where Madeleine Albright says, yeah, killing 500,000 Iraqi children has been worth it, worth the effort to get rid of Saddam. So, yeah, I mean, you bring the troops out of the Middle East, you terminate all the foreign aid, which you ought to do, including to the dictatorships, including to the Israeli regime. Terminate foreign aid to everybody. It's just welfare. It's a dole for dictators and other people. And then all of a sudden, the terrorist threat dissipates. People are going to start asking what they were asking in 1989. What do we need this huge military for? The drug war. There's articles. Did you all notice the articles this week where that global commission is calling for drug legalization? Here's the ex-presidents of countries. You got Paul Volcker there, ex-chairman of the Federal Reserve. All these renowned public officials are saying the drug war's failed. And then you had, I blogged last week, there's a couple of government reports, U.S. government reports saying all of the billions of dollars they've spent on the drug war for the past 40 years, because we've got an anniversary coming up, 40 years, and they have not stemmed the flow of drugs into the United States one bit. What's the military say? The military, the Pentagon, says, oh, no, we've got to keep waging the war on drugs. We're finally reaching some success. And guess what they're doing? They're using the drug war as an excuse to expand military bases, U.S. military bases and personnel in Latin America. So, I mean, they're already planning. They're saying, okay, well, if they bring the troops out of Iraq and Afghanistan, out of the Middle East, they just leave people over there alone. Just leave them alone. You don't need to be a colonialist. You don't need to establish dominance and control. Leave people alone. I mean, it'd be nice if they left us alone over here too, but leave those people alone. All of a sudden, the anger dissipates. The terrorist threat dissipates. We don't need the Patriot Act anymore. We don't need all the NSA spying. We don't need the illegal searches and seizures. We don't need all this war on terrorism crud. And the military knows that. And so people are going to start saying, well, what do we need this huge standing military for? They're just sitting around doing right face and left face and spit shining their boots, you know. I mean, what do we need to be, using all these tax monies? I mean, people are overburdened with taxes. What do we need? We could discharge all these soldiers into the private sector, where they get productive jobs. We release all the tax money that's being used to pay them now back into the pockets of people. Well, the military's getting geared up for that possibility because, they're supposed to be out of Iraq by December, and people are clamoring now to get out of Afghanistan. And of course, there's a big movement afoot in Congress to stop this Libya aggression. And now what the military is doing is using the drug war to expand its operations in Latin America. Now, notice something hypocritical and interesting about this. We don't permit the military to participate in the drug war here, at least not directly, because we have what's called the Posse Comitatus law. And what that law says is that the military will not be involved in law enforcement. Only the cops will. The idea is that the military has a different mindset than the cops. The military's mindset is to look at things as their war. They're going to be killing people. Their mission's to kill people. I mean, you saw it. Remember several years ago when you put the military on the border to enforce the war on immigrants? And the first thing they did was they shot this little 13-year-old guy that was tending his sheep. I think he was 13, but he was a teenager. And because that's what they've been trained to do, just shoot the enemy, Well, the guy was innocent, but they thought he was the enemy. And, the cops, despite the fact that the cops are becoming increasingly militarized in this country, they still look at things differently from the military, and that's a phenomenon reflected in Posse Comitatus. Well, isn't it interesting that we permit, encourage, order the military, the same military we don't want in our country defending, protecting us on these criminal laws, we send them into Latin America to be cops down there, to enforce drug laws down there. Now, is that not hypocritical? If the military is a bad thing here for domestic law enforcement, why isn't it a bad thing in Guatemala and Nicaragua and Mexico, wherever else the military is involved? Well, it is a bad thing. If the military is not going to be involved in law enforcement here, it shouldn't be involved in law enforcement there. But they are scared to death on this drug war movement too, because they see the handwriting on the wall. This is an exciting time for libertarians, because there's a possibility that everything may come together. And it may happen suddenly before, without, a lot of warning, is that all of a sudden, the troops are coming out of the Middle East. Terrorism dissipates. All of a sudden, what do we need a war on terrorism for? What do we need a big standing army for? What do we need all these taxes for? What do we need income taxation? And when people start seeing that the welfare state's cratering, and people start saying, well, what do we need these socialist programs for? Why can't we handle our own retirement? Why can't we honor our parents on a voluntary basis? Why can't we have a free market in health care? And then, now, of course, we're not there yet, but on the drug war, we libertarians, we're getting there. Because now got all these renowned figures on top of the federal judges and the cops and everything that are calling for an end to the drug war. These are times that are very, very interesting and very, very exciting for libertarians. Now, speaking of libertarians, I told you last week that CNN, who I'm sure portrays itself as a been paragon of democracy, I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if CNN was over there, pounding the drums for the democracy spreading bombs in Iraq, and the democracy spreading bombs in Afghanistan. Well, the democracy lovers at CNN, they won't let Gary Johnson into the presidential debate. And they say, oh, well, I guess they say, I'm not really sure what their standard is. They're kind of quiet about it, but I think it's because he's not registering high enough in the polls. Well, duh. For a dark horse candidate, a candidate come out of nowhere, that the idea he starts out at nowhere. Duh. That's what Clinton did. That's what Carter did. Give the guy a chance to make his case, especially since it's like a year and a half out. Here's a guy, it's not like he doesn't have credentials. And I'm not saying to vote for him or support him. You may support Ron Paul, you may support Mitt Romney or any of the other statists there. What I'm saying is let the guy into the process. What's the harm? It's not like he lacks credentials. It's not just some, deadbeat guy saying I'm running for president. This is a two-term governor of a state, New Mexico. But let me tell you what I think's going on here. The guy's a libertarian. I mean, Ron Paul ran into this 4 years ago, remember? When they said, they were trying to exclude him from these debates and stuff. Oh, well, he's not registering high enough. Look how far Ron Paul's come since then. I mean, he's in the polls, he's raising money. Everybody, knows who Ron Paul is. Well, maybe the New York Times doesn't, because sometimes they don't mention him in their articles. But why not Gary Johnson? Well, my hunch is that the reason is, and I've talked about this before, is they're scared to death of libertarians. They're absolutely terrified of the progress we're making. You can see it in the drug war, where more and more people are calling for drug legalization. That's because of us libertarians. I mean, that we've been out here. We've been in the fields, hoeing away for 20, 40 years, really. And now foreign policy, that's all cratering. The welfare state's cratering. I mean, we all know that Medicare is bankrupting the country. And everything. We've been arguing for a free market in health care where you repeal these socialist programs. This is what statists don't want people to hear. They don't want them to hear the libertarian message. That, in my opinion, is the reason why they don't want Johnson in there. Because two libertarians on the same panel reinforcing each other, saying, get out of Iraq, get out of Afghanistan, legalize drugs, end this vicious, brutal, hypocritical war on drugs. They can't stand that. I mean, because it bursts their little illusions and their delusions. Do you recall a while back I talked about the statist box? Where all the statists are inside this box. And on the outside of the box, it's called the statist box. But you see, inside the box, they've got all these little, activities. But on the walls, it's all written, free enterprise, private property, limited government, the Constitution, support the troops, defending our freedoms, defending our rights. You see, because they're all living in this imaginary la-la land. But their feeling is, as long as they can keep up the delusion that everything's fine. Well, any psychiatrist will tell you that's just nonsense. I mean, delusions, operating under delusions, even if you think it's reality, is going to have adverse effects. In fact, my hunch is that if given that there's this huge drug problem in America, sufficient to wage a 40-year-old failed war, and their supply of drugs is still coming in. I mean, that indicates that there's a lot of people on drugs. My hunch is because of this status box. At least one of the reasons, where everybody's living this life of la-la land, this delusionary life that, this is freedom and this is free enterprise, and Social Security is the backbone of America's free enterprise system, and it saved America's free enterprise system along with Roosevelt's fascist socialist program known as the New Deal. And the Federal Reserve, it protects the stability of our money supply, even though the reality is the dollar's worth about a nickel compared to when the Federal Reserve was created. The troops defend our rights and our freedoms with their occupations in these foreign countries. You see, the statists feel that as long as they can keep living this delusion that everything's fine, they resent us libertarians, because we're like therapists. We bring reality to people, and especially young people. Because inside the statist box are all those little government schools and their government-supported schools, the little public schools. Well, what's that all about? Well, that's about starting at 6 years old to ingrain in these kids that your system, Franklin Roosevelt's, Lyndon Johnson's, Richard Nixon's welfare warfare state is the essence of freedom. It is freedom and free enterprise. Along come us libertarians and say, it's a lie. They're lying to you. This is a socialistic and fascistic and regulatory interventionistic welfare warfare state. You've got massive amounts of income taxation. You've got an income tax. I mean, Americans live without an income tax for more than 100 years, without an IRS. How can they both be freedom? How can the absence of the income tax and the IRS be freedom, and the presence of the income tax and IRS be freedom? Americans live without Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and education grants and public schooling and drug war and gun control and foreign wars and empires and bases all over the world, you know. They live without a military-industrial complex. They live without all this junk, and we extol them, with the exception of slavery and other exceptions like terrorists. We extol them as that's the model of freedom, that our heritage is a land of freedom. Here, everything's the opposite. We have all these socialistic programs, regulatory programs, government business partnerships. I mean, that's what Benito Mussolini's fascism was all about. This corporatism, this government business uniting that the statists love to extol. Well, we libertarians have broken free of the statist box, and we're pointing out it, saying, hey, that's a statist box. You've got statism here. And join up with us libertarians. If you believe in a free society, if you believe in economic liberty, if you believe in free markets, if you believe in the heritage of the Declaration of Independence, of fundamental rights, including economic liberty, if you believe in the original idea of a constitution that was a law that we the people imposed on government officials and they had to obey it, then join up with us libertarians. And the statists are seeing that. They're seeing what Ron Paul did when he was riding this wave of libertarianism, the wave that libertarians have been building for, 40, 50 years. And then he started to make the wave bigger, churning it with galvanizing young people that said, man, I'm in favor of ideals and idealism. And of course, that's what libertarianism is all about. It's about ideals and principles and integrity. And that's what they don't want. That's what the statists are trying their best to keep the American people from learning about. And I think that's the whole idea of okay, it's bad enough that Ron Paul's in there, but they ignore him. I mean, they don't put him in some of the articles or the notice the analyses, like in the Iowa caucuses that are coming up, New Hampshire primary. Notice how many times they just fail to just mention that Ron Paul's in the race and Gary Johnson. They are saying to themselves, look, don't give any attention to these libertarians because they're growing, they're getting more and more prominent, and people are starting to gravitate. And that's the whole idea. I mean, that's my argument. As we build up our numbers of libertarians, we can reach a critical mass that overcomes the status and the statism. Let me wrap this up by telling you about an article in the Times called "China Appears to be Moving to Halt Grassroots Candidates." And guess what they're doing? Well, there's people in China. We all know it's a monopoly state there. The communists have a monopoly on power. But there's people that are signaling that they want to run for office within this system. But they're sort of like, they're not all on the program, if you get my drift. I mean, it's sort of like what Ron Paul's doing in the Republican Party. They're kind of running with the system and trying to, do things to the system. Well, the Chinese authorities, they clearly have studied the American system. They're enacting barriers, like ballot access barriers to keep these people from running for office. And they're stating that their candidacies are illegal and that no one can run for office without first clearing a series of procedural hurdles. Sound familiar? I mean, isn't that what the statists here do to the Libertarian Party and the Green Party and the Independents? These ballot access restrictions, having to get all these little signatures, got to make sure they're valid. Campaign finance, donation, restrictions, complicated regulations where you got to hire a lawyer if you want to run for office to make sure your forms aren't messed up, and if your forms are messed up, they fine you. This is what the Chinese communists are doing. And their monopoly control is no different in principle than the monopoly control here that the statists have. As I've said before, the Democratic and Republican parties are one party. The statist party, the welfare warfare party, just sort of like one NFL, and then it's divided into two wings. You got the Democratic status and you got the Republican status, and they're going to do everything they can to maintain their grip on power. We just got to keep resisting them. We got to resist them in the game that we're in, the Future of Freedom Foundation. Hey, by the way, go to our website at fff.org. Subscribe to our email update. It's free. We keep spreading the ideas. You need to keep spreading ideas. The candidates like Ron Paul and Gary Johnson and libertarian candidates need to keep spreading the word. We do that, and we will overcome the moral debauchery, the bankruptcy, the bad way of life, the bad road that we're on, bankruptcy that the statists have brought our nation. That's the show for tonight. By the way, I won't be here next week, so it'll be 2 weeks from tonight. I'll see you then. Thanks so much for listening in, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.